Chinese President Xi Jinping arrived in Nay Pyi Taw on Friday for a state visit to Myanmar. It's President Xi's first overseas trip this year and the first visit to the Asian neighbor by a Chinese president after an interval of 19 years. Take a look.
The Chinese president attended a welcoming ceremony held by Myanmar President Aung on Friday. Expressing his goodwill towards the government and the people in Myanmar, President Xi Jinping pointed out that the two countries, linked by mountains and rivers, share deep friendship. Over the past 7 decades since bilateral diplomatic ties were established, China and Myanmar have developed their bonds on the basis of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which they both agreed on. President Xi also spoke highly of the achievements that have been made thanks to cooperation and exchanges in various areas. And the president called for bilateral ties to be pushed forward into the new era with deeper communication and closer strategic cooperation. After the welcoming ceremony held by Myanmar President Aung, Xi Jinping also met with State Councilor Aung San Suu Kyi. They agreed to hold more talks on Saturday to discuss China-Myanmar relations and other topics of concern to both sides. China is Myanmar's largest trading partner. Their total bilateral trade volume in 2019 was worth $17.7 billion. Meanwhile, Myanmar is active in China's Belt and Road Initiative. One of the biggest projects under the framework is the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor. And during President Xi's current visit, the two sides will seek to push forward substantial construction of the CMEC and boost friendship between the nations and prosperity in the region.
For more on Chinese President Xi's visit to Myanmar, in Tokyo we have Lin Tianwei, Senior Research Fellow at the National University of Singapore East Asia Institute. In Singapore we have James Crabtree, who is Associate Professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. And in our Beijing studio, Yang Xiyu, Senior Research Fellow at the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Mr. Yang, of course, I go to you first. 19 years, very first time, Chinese president to Myanmar. Obviously, a big mission this time. Mr. Yang.
Well, the President of China visited Myanmar this time brought very great and historical missions. Basically, include 2 missions. Number 1, strengthen the long-time tradition friendship between the two peoples. We call it Baopo, actually specified as a friendship between Chinese and the Myanmar peoples. Just like relations between friendship relatives. And secondly, more important, this visit is designed to implement the connectivities between the two countries, say Road and Belt Initiative. We call it connectivities between infrastructure, connectivities between institutions, and the connectivities between the two peoples.
Mr. Lim, of course, you've been doing research about the Belt and Road Initiative, and you're an expert about the region. How do you see the role of Myanmar could play in the collectively building mechanism of Belt and Road Initiative?
Well, there are many projects that are planned for Myanmar, and the main project is a Y-shaped corridor, which is known as the Myanmar or China-Myanmar Economic Corridor. And the main so-called feature of the Y-shaped corridor is actually a deep sea water port in Rakhine. And so this is all part of a connectivity project. In addition, overland, there will be a high-speed rail that is intended for connecting Yangon with Yunnan. It is seen to be a sort of a mutually beneficial project because Yunnan is relatively underdeveloped and Myanmar holds potential for trade. In addition, there is an overhaul of the trading district in Yangon itself. So all these are parts and parcel of the plan to integrate Myanmar into the Belt and Road Initiative, both via overland routes as well as connection to the maritime Silk Road component via the deep sea water port in Rakhine.
Mr. Crabtree, how do you see the very frequent interactions among China and its Southeast Asian neighbors in terms of trying to build as much connectivity as possible, given the fact the regionalization these days in different parts of the world are becoming ever more active?
Well, China's Belt and Road project is active in almost every country in Southeast Asia, but Myanmar's is particularly important. It's very large, so the projects that your previous contributor was talking about, the railway line and the port, these are huge projects in the billions of dollars. So they're some of the most important projects to the Belt and Road overall, but they're also some of the most controversial. The port is part of a long-term strategic aim that China has had to gain access to another coast, a west coast, as it were, on the Bay of Bengal. And the projects are also controversial within Myanmar because, for a start, they're expensive, and Myanmar is a poor country and it worries about the debt implications that these projects have. And then there are some other projects which are not to do with connectivity, but for instance the dam project, which are also controversial. So these projects are investment projects that bring money and investment, but they are not entirely without problems.
Mr. Yang, when you see projects being worked on, how do you think should be the attitude of the others? I mean, if you look at the project at its very beginning, the planning stage, and in operation, from planning to operation, there's a long process. How do you think China and its partners have been on this learning curve to make sure that the projects are ever more going to be mutually beneficial and also serve the long term?
Well, I think the attitudes is very critical issue among not only between the partners but also among the related parties, all related observers. Firstly, attitude between the partners, I think the key word is, as you mentioned, mutual benefit. And if both related parties feel the project will result in the mutual benefit, that would be great, and that will go to a positive results. But as a third-party observers, you know, from different angle, different people may have varied conclusion or remarks. But first, the most important thing is the objective attitude for the third party is very important. For example, regarding to the debt, not only the controversial issues in Myanmar project, many other places in the developing countries, they argue that, you know, the developing countries are poor and the huge debt will be a unsustainable burden. Such remarks has been emerging. However, if we look at the experiences of developing economies all over the world, no country can develop without debt. The key question is whether or not the debt is sustainable. So basically, both China and China's partner are highly cautious and responsible at the very beginning stage for the payable, affordable debt. That is the key element, has been in the planned cooperation between China and the related partners.
I see. Mr. Lin, ASEAN countries are very active these days, and of course, RCEP, for example, is one of those areas that ASEANs are working with the others as well, with China, with some of the other players in the region as well. So how do ASEAN countries see China's cooperation with Myanmar, and how does ASEAN countries see Myanmar as a member of the community? How much do you think the connectivity among members of the ASEAN and between members of the ASEAN and the other countries, this time China, could in a way serve a kind of framework for the region's future development?
Well, since December 2015, ASEAN has quietly come together to form the ASEAN Economic Community. The ASEAN Economic Community will have a collective market of 500 million people, or 500 million consumers. they want to break down the tariff barriers between ASEAN countries, intra-regional wise, and they want to increase intra-regional trade between ASEAN countries. So one of the components needed for for the encouragement of intra-regional trade would be infrastructure connectivity. And so in this way, the Belt and Road Initiative, as well as other regional initiatives, can help to build this infrastructural connectivity that ASEAN requires to realize the ASEAN Economic Community dream, which is to increase connectivity and intra-regional trade. And so ASEAN countries hope to work with China and also other international partners in order to build this infrastructure needed, and also to encourage the AEC, or ASEAN Economic Community's trade with external partners. In this sense, China can also play a part. So many ASEAN countries are trying to be intermediaries between China and the AEC to become pathfinders that can help Chinese economies, Chinese companies invest in ASEAN, and ASEAN companies and firms to invest in China as well. So the connectivity in Myanmar that's brought about by the deep water port, as well as the high-speed link between Yunnan and Yangon, will be part of this overall connectivity needed for the ASEAN Economic Community project.
I see. Let's also talk about China, Mr. Yang, if I could. Since we talk about the Yunnan province,
yep.
It's such a beautiful place, scenic province, well known for tourism.
Yep.
But on the other hand, there are certain areas of Yunnan that is not as developed as the other areas of Yunnan. So how would you understand a diverse province such as Yunnan and linking Yunnan with Myanmar, which is now still one of the least developed economies in the world? How would that relationship work?
Well, I think the connectivities between China and Myanmar as a general will contribute greatly to the connectivities between Yunnan province and the Myanmar related areas. You mentioned the diversities in Yunnan. Actually, Myanmar also is quite diversified. However, both sides commands different advantages. So the connectivities will enhance the great potentials from the both sides for the greater economic development. So I think when the connectivities between the two countries is enhanced, the first thing first, the first benefits will come to Yunnan from China's side. So I think Yunnan province has been ready and very active and positive towards these great connectivities with Myanmar.
I see. Well, we need to hear the other voice, and right now we have one on the phone, Dr. Yan Tan, who is a political analyst coming from Myanmar. Thank you, Mr. Tan, for trying so hard to link with us through Skype, but obviously this time it seems still the phone works better. That talking about infrastructure, right? Yeah. Communication infrastructure. So let me ask you, Mr. Tan, about this. 19 years, very first time for Chinese president to visit Myanmar. I saw a lot of ceremonies already. And how do people in Myanmar think about the opportunities as a result of cooperation?
I think the Myanmar people, I think China as a very good neighbor, and they would like to maintain a very good relation with China. But at the same time, they worry about some imbalance or some inequality in multilateral relation with China. But at the same time, I think as the President Xi said in the newspaper, that the mutual trust, mutual respect, and mutual support in between the two countries is quite important in bilateral relations.
Yes. Mr. Tan, of course, the world is changing so fast, so is our region in Asia. So how do you think Myanmar is looking at itself and say, this is where I am, and this is where I want to be? So what do you make of the roadmap Myanmar has so far?
I think Myanmar is moving towards further democratic nation, the nation building of a new state. But at the same time, Myanmar is facing challenges like development, economic challenges, and also the peace and reconciliation challenges. In resolving these challenges, I think that China is one of good friends of Myanmar. And Myanmar government and Myanmar people would like to maintain a very good relation with China.
Peace and stability, of course, is one of those important issues. Mr. Chen, I'm going to come back to you a bit later. Right now, I want to have the Chinese guest, Mr. Yang, also to comment about that. Since Mr. Chen, Mr. Yang, have been talking about, from Myanmar side, about peace and stability of his country. How can China play a constructive role together with other neighbors of Myanmar in this regard?
Well, firstly, we should recall China and Myanmar were two of the three sponsors of the very important principle. We call it peaceful coexistence 5 principles.
That's
in
right.
In mid 1950s, Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai and with Myanmar leader and Indian leader set and enhanced these very famous 5 principles of peaceful coexistence.
Yes.
And return to your question.
That is still the principle of Chinese diplomacy these days.
Yeah, also that is our guidelines and also has become the international norms. And returning to your question, whenever China wants to play a proper roles in the other countries' internal issues, first thing first is the 5 principle of peaceful coexistence.
What does that mean?
That means one of the 5 principles is non-intervention, and the mutual respect of the sovereignty. So based on the mutual respect of the equality of the sovereignty, based on the principle of non-interventions, then China can play under these limits or framework. China can play proper roles.
But Mr. Yang, one could argue that China is not the China as it used to be. Now it's the second largest economy in the world, and it has its economic, political, and security interests everywhere in the world. So will China still be able to hold on to those principles?
Yeah, it's a good point.
In regard to Myanmar, for example?
Yeah, good question. You may recall, in the 1950s, China was quite different from now. China's capability at that time were quite much smaller than now. However, the principle remained unchanged. So in 1950s, China played a role in Myanmar issues based on the 5 principles, now remain unchanged. So basically, China play a facilitators, mediators, and exchanges views or advisors, something like that. Never play something like a dictator or instructor. So basically, based on the equality of the sovereignties, China has explored a very unique way to contribute China's role into the Myanmar's issues.
Mr. Crabtree, if I could call on your expertise as well. As you may have noticed from Mr. Yang's remarks, throughout the past 60 to 70 years history, both as developing countries and at that time called third world countries, China and Myanmar has been enjoying quite some history of partnership and, shall we say, even brotherhood at that time as the third world country. How do you see at a different stage of development that relationship will be updated from your perspective, Mr. Crabtree?
Well, the relationship is a little bit unbalanced. China is an enormous country and is now a middle-income country. It has a GDP per capita of about $8,000 or $9,000. Myanmar is small economically and is very poor. And so, you know, this is a relationship of a giant and a minnow. Myanmar needs China very badly. It's an important partnership because it does most of its trade and much of its movement of people with China. But on the other hand, the real issue here is that China is perceived somewhat negatively by popular opinion in Myanmar, and that's partly because of history, because of the close relationship that was had between China and the previous government, the dictatorship that used to run Myanmar. And so while China is investing,
however,
and Mr. Xi has written his article today about cooperation, China, in a sense, has to win the trust of the people of Myanmar with every step. That, I think, is the thing.
However, according to some of the surveys I've been reading today in the international press, the respondents in Myanmar about China vis-a-vis some of the other countries, shall we say, I wouldn't name the name, in the world is much more favorable. It's interesting. Obviously, you and I have been reading different surveys, sir. Having said that, though, let me come back to the three of you once again, since we have very limited time left. So, to what extent do you think this visit will be described as a successful one, and how would you describe the nature of this development if it is a successful cooperation? Mr. Lim.
China wants to develop fraternal relationship with Myanmar. Fraternal relationship has been characterizing China's bilateral relations with its neighbors, including with Pakistan. So its desire is to build fraternity with Myanmar. Of course, the road ahead is very long. Myanmar itself is a very complex country, so it requires time and patience to pan it out.
Okay. Mr. Crabtree, 2 sentences. Same with Mr. Yang. Mr. Crabtree, please.
I mean, I think it will be seen as being successful. The question, I think, is, does China push Myanmar too far and too fast, ask it to do too much too quickly? I think if China takes a gradual approach and doesn't make Myanmar do anything it doesn't want to do, then it will achieve its aims.
All right. Mr. Yang, you want to respond to that? 2 sentences too.
Yep. The success of these top-level exchanges by this visit can be characterized by 2 terms. Firstly, enhancement of the long-time tradition and mutual respect and equal footing. And secondly, that will produce quite numerous agreements for the cooperation on connectivities.
All right. I want to thank the 3 of you, Yang Xi, James Crabtree, and Lin Tenwai. Also, on the phone, we want to thank Mr. Yan Myo-tan from Myanmar. Really appreciate it.